afternoon, and welcome to the Council of American Ambassadors Roundtable discussion with Ambassador Christopher Landau. I'm Kathleen Sheehan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council. Just two brief housekeeping notes before we get going. First, that we are recording today's conversation, and it will be posted on our website afterwards so that members who could not attend live can watch it later. And second, we strongly encourage questions from the audience. Just submit your questions. All you have to do is go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button and then write in your question. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone over to the Council's Senior Vice President, Ambassador Philip Hughes, who is going to introduce today's speaker and moderate the event. And so with that, Ambassador Hughes, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome to the Council's Roundtable Ambassador Christopher Landau, who recently completed his mission in Mexico City as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. A graduate of Harvard College and of Harvard Law School, Chris spent some 30 years in Washington legal practice, most of that time as a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, where he headed the firm's appellate litigation practice. He's briefed and argued cases before the Supreme Court and all federal courts of appeal and probably federal district courts as well. He was even shortlisted by President Trump as a potential nominee to the Supreme Court. Early in his legal career, he was a law clerk for Supreme Court Justices Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, and has served as an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University's Law Center. But his diplomatic distinctions come from heading the country's largest diplomatic mission, a mission to Mexico City. During his tenure there, he was marked by the entry into force of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement and unprecedented binational cooperation on migration. He also spearheaded innovative public diplomacy efforts during the pandemic. Of course, Mexico was constantly in the news during President Trump's administration, and of course, it's been a headline matter, the border crisis, in the months since President Biden has taken office. So our conversation with Chris today couldn't be more timely or more topical. I should add that Chris he was born into a foreign service family. His father, George Landau, served as ambassador to Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela, and actually was also the president of the Americas Society and Council of the Americas in New York, and put an indelible imprint on those Latin America-oriented organizations. I didn't get to work for George, but I got to work for his successors and appreciated all that he did for that organization. Chris is a trustee, by the way, of the U.S. Supreme Court Historical Society and a director of the Diplomacy Center Foundation. So with that, let me give you Ambassador Chris Landau.
Phil, thank you, Philip. Thank you so much for that introduction. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be with this group today and how honored I feel to have joined your ranks as former ambassadors. As Philip mentioned, I come from a foreign service family. My father was an ambassador, so this was kind of like the family business for me. And it was great after a 30-year frolic and detour in the law to come back to my roots. And I think it's wonderful that we have this kind of an organization that allows us all to share our thoughts and hopefully to influence the way that our successors handle things and that our country is represented in the world. I certainly know and have tremendous respect for a number of you who I know are on this call today. I don't know all of you, and for those that I don't yet know, I certainly hope that we can change that in the near future, because I feel like we've all gone through a very unique experience, and I think it's great that we have this council that allows us to pool our knowledge and our experiences. I certainly feel like I learned a lot of lessons in this position, And, I would love to be able to pass along my, kind of concluding thoughts to, to anybody who comes in the future, either to Mexico or any other post. I thought I would divide my remarks today into three parts. First, talking a little bit about Mission Mexico itself, then talking about my own experience in Mexico and my family's experience, because it was a shared experience. And finally, some more general thoughts about U.S.-Mexican relations. And I thought I might talk till, I don't know, maybe a little bit half past the hour, and then just open it up to Q's and A's and have a discussion with all of you. In terms of Mission Mexico, as Philip said, it's the largest diplomatic mission in the world in terms of number of people. The embassy in Mexico City is about half of the total. It's about 3,000 people altogether, of which the embassy is half. And there are 9 consulates general, 5 of which are along the border and the other 4 in the interior, and another 9 consular agencies. I didn't even know what a consular agency was. My dad was never in a country in a post with a consular agency. But basically, it's a outpost that just has contract personnel, often American citizens who live in the area, to really provide services to American citizens. And so those actually are quite useful outposts. So altogether, there are 19 outposts, the embassy, 9 consulates general, and 9 consular agencies across Mexico. And that reflects the fact that, that the relationship with Mexico is so complex. Again, everything is supersized. In fact, we're building a new chancery for the embassy in Mexico City. The current one is from the early 60s, and it's long since been outgrown. I mean, I think my office is probably the ambassador's office is probably the only one that's in its original form, pretty much. Other ones have all gotten kind of jerry-rigged and cut in half, and there's lots of windowless offices. The new chancery, I am told, will be 80% of the size of the entire State Department in Washington, which seems a little bit excessive to me. But certainly that was the cornerstone was laid before I got there, and is not expected to be finished for another, I don't know, year or two. Obviously, it got delayed by the pandemic. So, that's a pretty long process. It'll probably be 6 or 7 years altogether for that process to play itself out. One thing, again, being in a mission that has, half the personnel outside the embassy just presents some different challenges as ambassador, morale challenges. I was fortunate that I got out to visit all 9 of the consulates general before the pandemic hit. In fact, I finished up my last visit to hit the last 2 of them in early March. So literally just a week or 2 before, we started to kind of have to shut things down last year. So, I think that was always it was great fun for me just to get to see the folks doing a lot of the work in different parts of Mexico. Of course, when I say 3,000 people working there, the vast majority of them are Mexicans, the LES, locally employed staff. And, as I suppose a lot of you recognize, the LES are in many ways the crown jewel of the embassy. And I always try to, acknowledge their many contributions to our mission. Mexico, one of the reasons that we have such a big footprint there is that more Americans visit Mexico than any other country by far. I mean, let's say in 2019, there were 40 million Americans visited Mexico. Canada was next with about 15 million, and then UK was about 4, France and Italy about 3. So you can get a sense that in Mexico, consular issues loom very large. There's also more Americans who live in Mexico than any other country in the world. This was actually something that was a little bit embarrassing to me. Always people would ask me, how many Americans live in Mexico? You think the American ambassador to Mexico could answer that question, but there's a lot of uncertainty there, and there's no firm statistics. It's anywhere probably from 1 million to 2 million. And they fall into different buckets. I mean, you have retirees who buy a place in San Miguel de Allende or in Los Cabos, but you also have a lot of people who otherwise, to all intents and purposes, appear Mexican, but their parents went and gave birth in a hospital on the U.S. side of the border, and they got birthright citizenship that way. But then, immediately came back to Mexico, and are native Spanish speakers and whatnot. So, it was a very mixed bag in terms of who the Americans in Mexico are and what services they might require from our mission. Having so many Americans there obviously leads to, particularly tricky issues. You all may remember in the news a couple of years ago, one of the worst days of my tenure was in November of 2019, when there was a Mormon family that was killed in northern Mexico, not far from the U.S. border, actually. This is a family that had been in Mexico for probably more than a century. And it appears to have been a terrible case of mistaken identity, that the bad guys from the drug cartels were waiting to ambush some rival cartel members, and this family just happened to drive up. But there are just lots of issues like that come up in Mexico, given just the physical closeness of our countries, with a 2,000-mile border, as you can imagine. And just the number of people crossing the border both ways. In terms of the mission itself, it was incredible, the number of agencies under our roof, or under our roofs, I should say. I mean, not only do we have all the law enforcement agencies like you might expect, like DEA and DHS and its Homeland Security investigations, but also agencies like the Marshal Service, the IRS, lots of criminals from the United States, convicts, flee to Mexico and have to be returned. And, we're seeking extradition not only of kind of the drug lords, as you might expect, but also of, routine, domestic violence people. So, there's a constant stream of those issues. I think there are more parts of the U.S. government represented in the mission in Mexico than in any other mission. Again, as you might expect for a neighboring country. We have APHIS for plant inspection services, and we had an APHIS agent murdered while I was there. There are water commissions trying to allocate the water equitably in the Colorado River, the Rio Grande. We have Treasury has a big presence there for a lot of money laundering issues. Department of Labor and Department of Energy have attaches there. So this was actually a big change from my father's day. Again, as Philip said, he was ambassador in Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, Mexico's always been a more complicated post, but it was a particular eye-opener for me that I'd say, the majority of people under my control were not State Department people. And that just added a layer of complexity. In fact, I would say I had a lot less interaction with folks in the State Department than in other agencies in the government, than with the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security and the White House. And so I think in that sense, Mission Mexico is probably somewhat unique, but I do get the sense that more generally throughout our diplomatic missions, the alphabet soup of government agencies has really increased, and the percentage of state has shrunk somewhat, which is just an interesting development. Again, it was fascinating for me coming back to this world after having grown up in it, 40 years ago. My father retired in '85, and right when I graduated from college. So I felt kind of like Rip Van Winkle, that I was very familiar with this world through my family experience, and then really, left and had an entire career in the law, and came back, and it had really changed a lot. And I was always very interested to note the things that had changed. And to me, the real rise of other agencies with international presence, beyond state, was a real change. And one of the real challenges, I thought, was the need to master the interagency process. Again, at least in Mexico. Again, Mission Mexico is on the radar screen in Washington. We had lots of visits from, at least until COVID hit, from cabinet members, from CODELs. It was a challenge in that sense. Or challenge may be the wrong word. It was an interesting. It was different than what I was used to. I mean, I can certainly assure you that when I was growing up in Paraguay, we were not getting many cabinet visits. One interesting thing, again, is that whenever we did get anybody official when I was growing up, they would always stay at the ambassador's residence. And now nobody ever stayed with me. I think I might have had one official visitor stay with me. I just think people now tend to come with big delegations, and it's gotten much more of a big deal, and people seem to just prefer to stay in a hotel. The residence is maybe about a 20-25 minute drive from the Chancellery, so it's not necessarily the most convenient thing. But again, I was excited to be able to host some of these interesting people, and that almost never happened. Again, I think in a supersized mission like Mexico, it's just very different than it is in a place like Paraguay. And, that cuts both ways. I mean, I said this to people a lot. In a smaller embassy, it's a lot more like a family. And, a close-knit community. It's just like growing up in a small town. In a place like Mexico, I think it's the opposite challenge, where people feel a little bit isolated sometimes and don't have those strong community ties. So in a sense, it's a bigger city with more cultural offerings and more to do. But the flip side is that the American community was certainly a lot less cohesive. And the American community in Mexico, as you might imagine, is not just heavily an embassy or U.S. government community. There's a big American private sector community there, student community, tourist community. So it was very different in that sense. And again, cutting both ways. It's just, can't say one is better or worse. They're just different. Let me just talk a little bit about my tenure there. First of all, the post had been vacant for more than a year before I got there, which I think is inexcusable for a country like Mexico. And again, I'm not looking to cast blame on anybody, but I do think that in this past administration, posts were left open for way too long. And, the Senate and the White House were kind of pointing fingers at each other, and I don't want to get into that, but I certainly hope that, maybe we as an organization can try to do more to try to emphasize the importance of having an ambassador at post. Particularly in a place like Mexico, it's just unseemly, and they took it as a slight. And I know Mexico was hardly unique in this regard, but certainly I was very eager to get there, and I went down. I was confirmed, I think, on the 1st of August. They made me do, I suppose some of you had to do this too, the security training out in West Virginia. Which is, I don't know, maybe about 5 days or so. And then I was sworn in, and I was on a plane to Mexico, within, 2 weeks of my confirmation. And in fact, I came back then a month later for my official swearing in, partly because I just wanted to get to Mexico as quickly as possible, and partly because nobody's in Washington in mid-August anyway. And in truth, I think it's fair to say that I had two very different tenures in Mexico. And I suppose this was true for a lot of my colleagues during the Trump administration. One was before COVID and one was after COVID. It was wonderful arriving in Mexico City. I'd been there but only about 25 years ago, and it's one of the great cities of the world. I went from the airport straight to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I presented some flowers to Our Lady. Something that was just meaningful to me, and I thought would be appreciated by the Mexicans, and it was. And my parents always had a tradition. The first night they arrived at a new embassy, of hosting at the residence, which then, of course, was obviously unfurnished, but that only kind of emphasizes the point. A reception where they would greet every single person, the Americans, the local employed staff, everybody, that first evening, so that everybody doesn't have this question, have you met the new ambassador yet? And I really liked that idea, but that was kind of nixed on the advice of my staff that, you know, it's just Mexico is too big to make that work. The reception line would just be impossible. Parking in the area is not great. It was, you know, on like a Thursday evening of the week. And so anyway, we did a town hall instead. I still kind of regret not being able to do that, but I did make a point those first few weeks of going around to every, you know, part of the embassy, one subdivision at a time, and shaking everyone's hand and just introducing myself so that people would hopefully meet the new ambassador relatively quickly and not have to do awkward introductions in an elevator at some later point. Again, we've outgrown the Chancery building in Mexico City, so, you know, we're somewhat spread out all around town in different places, which made that harder. But I think people always appreciate that, and I think it's just important for the ambassador to kind of plant the flag everywhere and just, you know, reach out and introduce himself or herself to everyone. So, you know, I really enjoyed that and thought that was a good use of my time in those first few weeks. You know, I don't know how it was for all of you. I think security has gotten a little bit overboard in the days, particularly since Benghazi. You know, diplomatic security is now a huge bureaucracy of its own. Again, that's a real change from my parents' days. And I had 8 people with me at all times when I was out and about. I had an advance car with 2 folks. In my car was the driver and a bodyguard up front. And then there was a follow-up car with 4 people. Half were embassy employees, half were Mexican National Guard people. And one of the curious things is that even though I had a big armored BMW, it always surprised me that the American ambassador had a German car. You know, that was unheard of. Back again in the day, it was always the latest American car. And then there was nothing for the spouse or the family. So my wife, when she arrived, was taking Ubers and the kids. You know, it seemed like a little bit of an odd separation or an odd way to distribute the resources. And again, I think this was something that really struck home to me, was the changed role of the spouse over the time since my folks were doing this. And, you know, I understand a lot of spouses now have careers of their own and don't want to do the whole diplomatic thing, which I respect and which is totally fine. But I think it's kind of too bad now that there's no support for a spouse like my wife, Caroline, who actually did want to do it and did want to go to National Day receptions and did want to, you know, get out and about, and the fact that there is no support, I mean, no car and driver for the spouse. And again, I think what happened over the years was that some people wound up abusing that, and so the whole thing got taken away. But, you know, I think the pendulum, from my perspective, has swung too far. You know, so my family was with me for the first few weeks, and then the kids had to go back to school in the States to finish up some schooling there, and my wife went back with them. So I was alone for most of the first few months, which actually turned out to be okay because I was settling in, and then they had a separate, when they eventually came at Christmas time and the kids went to school down there for that second semester, I was kind of settled by the time they had to get settled, so we weren't all kind of going through this at once. So I think that worked out pretty well for us. But from the beginning, you know, I introduced my family on social media. I took the ambassador's, the official Twitter handle, which had about 25,000 followers when I got there. I started posting pictures of us going around the city and enjoying some of the cultural sites. I quickly went up to about 40,000 just within a few weeks. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I posted a picture of us on the floating gardens at Xochimilco, and that got 10,000 likes. I think before that on my personal Twitter account, I'd never gotten more than 2 likes. So it was a big eye opener just to the power of social media. And particularly when you kind of let people in, you know, not just giving policy pronouncements, but also just talking about how you and your family are enjoying the country. It's not for everybody, but I enjoyed it, and it seemed to go over well. Where I really got a lot of followers was when I said, wait a second. So, you know, now I have 40,000 followers. I'm looking at my friend here, the American ambassador to Greece, Jeff Pyatt, and he has 140. How can Mexico with 130 million people have fewer followers for the American ambassador? So I got a friendly competition going between Mexico and Greece. You know, before I knew it, I gained another, I don't know, you know, 25, 30, 40,000 followers. And I was able to, I think, bypass Jeff at 150,000 at about 6 months into my tenure, and the Mexicans would always ask me, how are you doing against the guy in Greece? And ended up my tenure there with about 280,000, which was, I thought that was just a great way to connect with people. And one thing I liked particularly was I get a lot of consular questions on there. People would respond to whatever I post and say, well, hey, I got a visa problem, blah, blah, blah. I would just, I created a way for me just to basically refer through Twitter those questions to a consular account that was set up that would then answer the questions. I think even though a lot of the answers were on the official embassy website, nobody can find it. And I felt like that was a great way to just kind of connect with people and bring, information about consular issues in a way that people is just more accessible to folks. One of the things that was very interesting to me about Mexico in general, and I don't know how all of you felt with your experiences, is that, when my parents were doing this back in the 70s and 80s, they were going out to social events, I don't know, 4 or 5 nights a week. And I was, steeled for that, not looking forward to it, but ready for it. And, lots of formal black tie events. They would give big black tie dinners at the residence. And there was almost none of that in Mexico. I got very few invitations to social events in the evenings. And again, maybe this is a Mexican thing, that's kind of considered family time. Most of the National Day receptions were more around the lunchtime, which made it just very hard to break up the day. But, my wife and I wound up making some personal friends over time, and we did things with them, but there was just a lot less entertaining. And I'd be curious if that was true for other people as well in recent years. I did like to, get out and about, and certainly I ultimately managed to travel to all 32 states of Mexico, and I think people just enjoyed that. I think people enjoyed seeing that I was obviously enjoying myself in the job and being there. Obviously with the pandemic, things came to an abrupt halt, and basically, spent the first 3 months just holed up in the residence. We went down almost overnight in March of 2020 to, only about 10% capacity. It was critical, particularly in Mexico, to keep that kind of capacity on the consular side, because there are programs like the H-2A visa program that sends a lot of agricultural workers up here. And as soon as we started shutting down our embassy operations, I had a phone call from the Secretary of Agriculture, like, "Hey, the ag sector is freaking out. What can we do to make sure that continues?" I said, "Mr. Secretary, let me give you my assurance that I understand that that's a national security issue for our country, and we will make sure that the embassy continues to process this." And to their credit, they did. We had a tremendous consular team, particularly up in the Consulate General in Monterrey, that kept that program going, and no temporary workers were prevented from proceeding to their work in the United States because of the cutbacks in in-person personnel at the mission. But obviously, it became a very different job when you're mostly working from home, and it got a little bit crazy because the President Trump invited President López Obrador to go visit him in the White House in July of last year, so in the middle of the pandemic, and the President of Mexico accepted. He flew commercially because he had gotten rid of his Mexican jet. Not only did he fly commercially, but at that point there was no longer a nonstop flight between Mexico City and Washington, so he had to change planes in Atlanta. So it was very, very challenging, as you might expect. And I know some of you on the phone call were ambassadors under COVID, and others of you not, but it was a particularly challenging time to be an ambassador. And, for instance, our 4th of July reception had to go virtual, which, in a sense was a bummer, because it's a wonderful event. But by the same token, it kind of pushed us to think about it in new ways. So I took the budget we were going to use for that, and I did a video instead. And, my understanding is that was viewed across different social media platforms close to 1 million times. So in a sense, instead of just seeing, maybe 1,500 people at a big reception at the residence and trashing the lawn, maybe it is more effective to do things virtually nowadays, or maybe you could do both. But certainly, I tried to think creatively about ways to continue doing our mission during the pandemic, because obviously the issues didn't go away. Just to talk briefly about some of the issues, and we can maybe get into this more in the Q&A session. to the extent that those of you in the call are interested in them. I mean, the three big ones in Mexico are trade, migration, and drugs. Not necessarily in that order. That kind of changed every day. But there was some good news on the trade front. Certainly, as Philip mentioned, the USMCA went into force. Up to my early months, there were still congressional delegations coming. It was not a done deal yet by any means. So we got that thing over the finish line. And frankly, I think a lot of people don't understand that Mexico, Canada, and China tend to rotate being our #1 commercial partner at any given time. And in 2019, it was actually Mexico. So the commercial relationship with Mexico is huge. And that caused huge problems during the pandemic, and particularly to keep those supply chains open after both our countries shut down and went to essential industries only. And that was probably, I think, the hardest time for me was just trying to use spit and chewing gum to keep those supply chains going. I get these frantic calls from US CEOs: if we don't get our Mexican parts in the next 2 days, we have to shut down our operations here. And somehow we made it happen, which was great. On the migration front, I was fortunate in a way that I missed the biggest confrontation between our countries, which happened in the spring before I got there, when a lot of the caravans were coming through, because President López Obrador had announced when he got in late 2018, a relaxation of the southern border. We welcome our Central American friends. Well, they came by the hundreds of thousands, but weren't interested in staying in Mexico, kept going to our border. And finally, President Trump said enough is enough and threatened tariffs. And by the time I got there, that had worked itself out. And we actually had a very good cooperative relationship with Mexico that really, I think, deterred people from making the trip. So for the most part, that problem was already mostly solved when I got there. We were very concerned, when COVID hit, that we wouldn't have big movements of medical refugees, and managed to keep that under control with a program that allowed us to expel people, immediately because of the pandemic. Finally, probably my greatest frustration was in the counter narcotics area. That is just a very difficult issue. I'm very frustrated at our government, which I feel doesn't really have a comprehensive strategy to attack this problem. But DEA, God bless the men and women of that agency. They care, they do a great job, but they're in the Department of Justice, and they, I think, see their role as basically an Elliot Ness role of catching a bad guy, having them do the perp walk, and having them do time. And that's an important part of the strategy. You don't want those people to feel comfortable, but I don't think that's going to solve the whole problem. And so that's one. When Philip was introducing me, he said, Chris completed his mission in Mexico. I feel in a lot of ways, especially I was only there a year and a half, that I didn't complete my mission. There was a lot of things that we were still doing, making good progress, but it was a frustration. I'd say, my mission terminated, but there was a lot of things on all these topics, commercial, migration, trade, where, I felt like I was really getting things going, but you can't generally complete things in a year and a half, and especially once the pandemic hit. So, that was a frustration, but it goes with the job. So I have to say, for me, those were, the happiest times of my life. It was just such an honor to be an ambassador, represent our country. It's the experience I'm sure all of you have had, and why I'm just delighted to be part of this club. I think with that, I've gone over the amount of time I'd hoped to speak. I hope I haven't been overly boring. And why don't we just go to Q's and A's now?
Chris, thank you very much for a very insightful and personal discussion of your tenure in Mexico City. We have a couple of questions from members already submitted. And let me just take them in the order in which they've been received. Ambassador.
Take them in the order of easiest to hardest.
Well, actually, no, the first two are equally hard. So
okay. I'm used to hard questions. It goes with the turf.
Ambassador A.B. Culverhouse, our former ambassador to Australia, asks, which of our strategic adversaries presents the greatest challenge to U.S. interests in Mexico?
I would say China, not surprisingly. I mean, I remember at one point I got wind that there was a Russian kind of a junior varsity operation to try to, send disinformation to the States. But China is in everybody's mind. One of the things I thought was very effective in the last administration was that I think across the world, there was a very unified message that we have to think long and hard about the China challenge. I'll say though, having attended a number of these conversations, talked to a lot of colleagues, I think for me in Mexico, the kind of, geopolitical, China-Russia issue was just less of it loomed less large. And I don't know if that's just because other issues loomed relatively larger, like, migration and drugs and getting USMCA over the threshold. China has not made the same push in Mexico as it has in many other parts of the world, including in Latin America. I think, they kind of know that the US, has such a dominant presence there. So I would say in terms of, direct foreign investment in Mexico, China may be in the top 10, but may not be. It may be around number 10. I mean, it's behind countries like Italy and Spain and Australia. So it has not been a focus for China. And one thing that was interesting for me, I thought the Mexicans would try to get leverage against us by trying to kind of play us off against China and say, well, look, we have those guys over there who are willing to offer us all kinds of goodies if you don't, lighten up on us a little bit. But the Mexican president actually said the opposite when I presented credentials. He said, something, we realize that we're on your team, that we have a shared border, a shared history. And, so he did not try to play that card at all. So, while I think it's important, I went out and I did the 5G Huawei dog and pony show. That was actually one of the worst experiences I had, though, I have to say, telling Carlos Slim that he should not do 5G with a Huawei, because I kind of felt like my talking points were all like, don't do 5G with Huawei. And I didn't, he said, well, okay, who do you want me to do it with? You don't have another 5G competitor or another 5G alternative. And, my talking points didn't cover that area. So, but I do feel like, I know Keith Kroc, followed up with me quite a lot. I mean, I do feel like, this is an area where the needle probably moved permanently, that the United States government institutionally kind of has really recognized China as a strategic competitor. And I think all over the world, certainly, again, for me in Mexico, it wasn't as big a deal as it was for people, where China was, becoming their #1 investor, but it was certainly on my radar screen.
Okay, great answer. Ambassador Tom Korologos, our former ambassador to Belgium.
Another friend of mine. I'm getting all my friends. AB, Tom Korologos.
Someone you surely know from your law career in Washington, says, hello, Chris, welcome back. Congratulations on your service. You had it in your DNA. So Tom's question is, if you could give us a quick rundown on the cartels. We know from the media what they do, but perhaps you could give us some insights into how they operate. How are they funded? How do they get away with what they do, including coyotes throwing kids over the wall?
It's a very good question. And, I think it's a very important question because I think we throw around the word cartel a lot. And, I think anybody who is involved in criminal activity in Mexico is generally regarded as a cartel here. But just, to some extent, that's a little bit of a misnomer because that suggests a pretty tightly structured organization. And in some cases, these are much more loosely affiliated groups. Often they start with a family base. So I think it's a mistake to just think of the Mexican cartels as, very tight-knit organizations. And this was something that I would get intel and other reporting from Washington talking kind of loosely about the cartels. And I would kind of bounce back from Mexico City. Well, could you be more specific what you're talking about? But I mean, when they arrested the former Secretary of Defense of Mexico, Cienfuegos, during my tenure, for drug trafficking, the indictment says, oh, he was with these cartels. I mean, he was with like 2 guys. I mean, everything gets, once it gets called a cartel, it's like everybody thinks it's Sinaloa, right? Or CJ&G. So anyway, that's just a kind of a caveat in general, that I think it's a problem in our discourse that we kind of use that term very loosely. Again, but without underestimating the threat. Look, it's a big problem in Mexico, and it's hard as the American ambassador to say, guys, this is a problem not just for us. It's a problem for you, because these folks have effective control over large parts of your country. The estimates go anywhere from 35 to 40% of the country. Obviously people can argue what effective control means, but I think there's no question that they play a very large role in the government of Mexico. The current president, López Obrador, I think has a very ambitious domestic agenda, and which is mostly about social programs. It's kind of like he wants his great society in Mexico. And he sees the cartels, I think, to continue the analogy, as his Vietnam, which it has been for some of his predecessors. And so I think he wants to he sees that as a distraction from focusing on his agenda. So he has basically adopted a pretty laissez-faire attitude towards them, which is troubling to our government, obviously. I think is a big problem for Mexico, but they've also gotten quite brazen. I mean, while I was there last summer, the CJ&G cartel, the Guadalajara cartel, actually ambushed the head of Mexico City's security ministry, I don't know, maybe about 10 blocks from the residence on Avenida Paseo de la Reforma, which is like one of the main drags of Mexico City, in a very exclusive residential neighborhood at about 6 in the morning. And they didn't kill him, fortunately. They killed some of his security detail and some passersby. But I mean, there had never been a brazen attack like that in the heart of Mexico City. And somewhat to my shock, the Mexican central government basically did nothing. They didn't say, enough is enough. We can't put up with this. I mean, I think AMLO is very insistent on trying to avoid that kind of conflict. And as you also may remember, one of the, again, worst days during my tenure was when they caught the son of Chapo it was the Mexican military that did this. That they don't really have much of a great police force in Mexico, so a lot of actions are done by the Mexican military, even domestic actions. But they kind of sent a military SWAT team in, and this was up in Culiacan in Sinaloa, and they had captured him, and then almost within minutes, his organization had surrounded the perimeter of the area and had taken hostages, and basically the Mexican government backed down and let him go because they didn't want to have more widespread bloodshed in Culiacan. It was just a terrible moment. But the truth is, the Mexican military was outgunned, and one of my concerns as ambassador was to try to address the flow of illegal weapons from our country into Mexico, which allows the cartels to be armed to the teeth. I mean, we're not talking about little pistols. We're talking about military style, 50 caliber, weapons, the kind you see in Somalia on the back of the technicals. And so, I certainly, I respect as a lawyer our Second Amendment rights in this country, but whatever the right to bear arms means in the United States, there's certainly no Second Amendment right to export arms to another country in violation of our own export control laws. And, I tried to really beef up cooperation in that area. But, look, again, I think the cartels are a real menace for both countries. But the problem is that we can't do it on our own in somebody else's sovereign country. And, the Mexicans are very nationalistic. They're not going to let the Americans in to take care of the cartels. Believe me, President Trump literally offered that point blank to President López Obrador. He says, listen, I'll send our people down whenever you give me the green light, and we will take out the cartels. I'm not sure it's that easy, because again, I think if you cut the head off the snake has 5 heads all of a sudden. But I do think that there is more that we have to do in both countries, to try to weaken these organizations, particularly on the money front. I mean, people have been talking about this for 30 years. I mean, those of you who were ambassadors 30 years ago probably remember that people were talking about it then. I mean, it's frustrating to me. There were many times when I
attend meetings on these issues of, counter narcotics and money laundering and all this. And I would say, well, can I have the notes of the last meeting on this? And I get notes back to, 15 years, and it's the same issues. They haven't changed. And, so it's just very frustrating. But, there has to be the political will in Mexico to go after them. And, in a sense, as long as there is such a strong demand for drugs in our country, this is the Mexican perspective, which I think is not without some merit. I mean, it's not an either or proposition. You got to try to attack it on both ends, but there is going to be a way. Drug smugglers will find a way, and just arresting some is not going to really solve the problem if there is a $1 trillion market for this kind of stuff over the border. So it's that's a long slog. And one of the things I'd like to speak out and write about more is I just don't think that the United States has a comprehensive, coherent counter-narcotic strategy. And I don't blame that on any particular administration. That's not a partisan statement. I think we as a country, even though it seems to me the kind of issue that should be a bipartisan issue. But it's certainly not something that we can outsource to Mexico to solve our problem. I mean, it's outsourcing anything like this is very difficult, but we need to do what we can within our own control. Sorry for the long answer.
Complicated question. You asked about hard questions and easy questions. I said neither of them was really easy. Let me take you back to something that you shared with us about President López Obrador at the moment of your credentials presentation, that he abjured playing China and the US off against each other. This is kind of paradoxical for a populist president, much of whose election rhetoric for years had been hostile to the United States and the role that the United States plays in Mexico. You'd actually think he might be instinctively inclined otherwise. But you represented the United States at a moment, admittedly and sadly, only beginning about halfway through President Trump's administration, but you represented us to a country that is one of the very most important to us, although we don't always treat it that way, and certainly has a great impact domestically on the US. But at a moment when our president had been very critical before election, during the election, and after the election of Mexico, and during whose early presidency, Mexico elected a president who had been rhetorically very hostile to the United States. Yet during those two administrations, we accomplished some remarkable things together. One, kind of maybe a little bit predictable, the renegotiation of the US-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, because that's important to all three countries, but one very unpredictable, the migration cooperation across borders that you wouldn't necessarily have thought a Mexican government headed by AMLO would have been willing to do. What was it like to represent the US to Mexico in this particularly complex and convoluted environment? And what was sort of your strategy for handling this locally?
Well, it was a fascinating moment for the reasons you state, and it could have gone off in a very different direction. In fact, I think most people expected it to basically go off in a very ugly direction. In fact, AMLO during the campaign had written a book called Oye Trump, which is basically called like, hey, listen up, Trump, which was pretty defiant towards Trump. But I think, that was his campaign mode. And once he got into office, I think something that was very clear to him was that it was in his interest politically to have a good relationship with the United States. I mean, I think, that looms, the United States looms large in the lives of all Mexicans. And, I think by now, anti-American rhetoric, I think, has toned down in Mexico, as so many Mexicans have now a brother or a cousin who lives there, and the links between the countries have become so much stronger. Our economies have become more intertwined. So AMLO, I think, made a very calculated political decision that he was going to have good relations with the United States. I think that's why, he stated that very frankly to me in that first conversation. And the truth is, beyond that, I think he and President Trump actually have a lot in common. I think they both recognize that. I mean, they both came into office as anti-establishment
candidates. AMLO formed his own party, and President Trump basically had a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And so they both had that kind of outsider perspective, attacking what they called a corrupt domestic elite. And I think they just I think they kind of admired each other, or they felt a certain sympathy towards each other, a certain connection. And AMLO was very, I think he understood that for President Trump, the migration issue was a key issue, and I think was willing then to help him on that. I mean, the truth is, AMLO kind of set about, as I kind of referred to briefly, the migration crisis that we had in early 2019 by his own policies, which made it easier to get into Mexico. And so I think he realized that he was to blame for that. But never before has the United States and Mexico had the kind of migration cooperation that we have now. On the other hand, it's a new phenomenon where the migratory flows are, at this point, we're becoming majority non-Mexican for the first time in history. And Mexico has seen itself as the migrant champion because it provided the migrants. But now all of a sudden, within Mexico, you're seeing people from Kazakhstan, from Bangladesh, from Brazil, from Haiti, from Cuba, coming into Mexico. And this is a new phenomenon that I think the Mexican view of migration is changing. And people were starting to think about, is this good for us? And so, AMLO made his first and so far only foreign trip to visit President Trump in the White House at the height of the pandemic, amidst considerable domestic criticism that he was, favoring President Trump by going during an election year. And I think he just liked President Trump because I think he felt like President Trump was a straight shooter with him. And President Trump, we were, I think, very respectful of Mexican sovereignty. I mean, there was many things that AMLO was doing domestically in terms of, the energy sector. And, it was a very tricky thing. I mean, I want to protect American companies and investors. That's part of my job. But I also don't want to get involved in Mexican domestic issues. So, I think he respected the fact that, he knew that the migration issue was important to President Trump. And then apart from that, we weren't giving him a hard time on a gazillion other issues. And I think they kind of understood each other that way. So, I'd like to think it was all my diplomatic prowess that allowed everybody to come together and sing Kumbaya. But I think more generally, interestingly, the opposition in Mexico, even though AMLO is a leftist, again, he kind of came from, kind of a populist left. The more traditional conservative party was totally in the tank for Hillary Clinton. I mean, you had people, this is the PAN, in the PAN, like wearing, Hillary t-shirts, like, so interestingly, I think AMLO saw a lot of his domestic opponents more in sync with the Democratic Party. Again, it was just, politics makes weird bedfellows. And I think we saw that in that example.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, in that connection, let's continue a bit further with AMLO as we utilize the rest of our time here. Some superficially have suggested, those who perhaps don't know Mexico very well, have suggested that President Trump's verbal, criticism and rhetorical hostility to Mexico over a long time helped produce the phenomena of AMLO, ostensibly the most anti-American or truculent president in modern Mexican history, except he's turned out not to be that. But those who maybe know Mexico a bit better see AMLO as kind of the more or less natural reaction, natural consequence of the failures of the recent PAN and Institutional Revolutionary Party pre-governments that preceded him. And some of those failures or some of those scandals had been pointed out recently by testimony given by the General Counsel of Pemex, Emilio Lozoya, who alleged all kinds of corrupt deals made by Pemex, the Mexican national oil company, with officials of both the PRI and the PAN. Could you explain to us where AMLO really comes from and how that background in Mexico?
Yeah, sure. And without getting too into the weeds of Mexican domestic politics, you know, this is again a great name, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, right? I mean, talk about an oxymoron, right? But you know, it actually was a perfect name because it was the party that emerged out of the ashes of the Mexican Revolution, but then ruled Mexico with, you know, a pretty iron fist for the next 80 years. And they lost in the year 2000 to Vicente Fox and the PAN, which had been kind of a conservative, like, House opposition. It was kind of a Christian Democratic party, but again, you know, they were kind of propped up so that the PRI could show to the whole world, like, hey, look, we have an opposition party here, and they were totally unprepared to govern, and they didn't really, when they came in 2000, change any of the fundamentals of Mexican society. So, you know, AMLO calls what he is doing now the fourth transformation of Mexico, and I think in a way, after the independence, the wars of reform in the mid 19th century and the revolution in the early 20th century. In a way, he is capitalizing on the fact that the PAN, which came in to substitute the PRI in the early 2000s, failed to take a broom and clean house in Mexico. And there was a pent-up demand for this after 80 years, even to the point of, you know, rewriting the histories to you know, put more balance from what the official story of the PRI had been. So I think AMLO is basically, he's totally a creature of Mexican domestic politics. You know, Trump had nothing to do with AMLO's rise to power. It was basically a failure of the two parties that you know, PRI for 80 years, and then since 2000, they'd alternated in power. But there was no change, no substantial change. And I think the average Mexican was just fed up with the corruption and turned to AMLO, who was kind of one of these perennial candidates. He was kind of like the Harold Stassen of Mexico. I mean, he'd run, I don't know how many times, but, you know, he offered real change, and he's giving them some pretty significant change. But, you know, another interesting thing he told me in that first conversation is, I'm a domestic president. I'm not really interested in international affairs. And I think the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy. And I think he's been very true to that. But again, I think that shows that, you know, Trump, all these outside forces in the world really had nothing to do with AMLO, and he's not really interested in that. One of the things that I found the most aggravating was that during my tenure, I got a memo produced from somewhere in the US government, I won't get into details, basically saying like AMLO's looking to, you know, be the leader of a Latin American leftist coalition against the United States. I said, this is ridiculous. This is totally not correct. I said, like, how does this even come to be? Like, how did, you know, I'm the American ambassador to Mexico. Like, I think this is totally wrong. And how, I'm told this was in the president's like daily briefing. How could that be? So, you know, that's a whole other issue that I'm sure some of you may be able to relate to. But, you know, whatever AMLO's flaws, he's certainly not looking to play a big role on the international stage. Unlike, you know, let's say a Chavez, who always kind of wanted to do that.
We've got time for maybe one last question. And since you mentioned the arrest of the Defense Secretary, the former Defense Secretary Cienfuegos, by U.S. authorities on your watch for involvement in drugs trafficking, I can't help but ask, since after that arrest, the Mexican Congress enacted some legislation that significantly cramps the ability of U.S. Agents to operate in Mexico and cooperate with their Mexican counterparts. Is that going to be a big problem in our future efforts together to combat drugs trafficking and cartel activity?
Yeah, let me take a step back and answer that question, because I think this audience will find this very interesting. So on the day I arrived in Mexico, as I said, I went from the plane to the Basilica to a town hall at the Chancery, and I, you know, said hello to everybody. Then I went up to my office for the first time, and you know, the DCM kind of shut the doors. Mr. Ambassador, something I need to tell you about. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York has secretly indicted under seal the former Mexican Defense Secretary, who, the Defense Secretary in Mexico is not a civilian as it is in the United States. It's actually the senior most military officer. So it's the head of the Mexican army is the Defense Secretary. And this person had been in the previous government, but he had only been out of office about, what, you know, 6 months by this time. It was still relatively, you know, early in the AMLO administration. And I said, no. I'm not gonna have this guy like arrested before. I'm not gonna sign off on something like this that I don't know anything about. Like I remember from history class reading about the Bay of Pigs, and I'm not gonna basically just sign off on something that seems that I can certainly tell is a very far-reaching import and that I have not been fully briefed on. So I said, okay, well, let me talk to my military attaché about how this is going to affect our relations with the Mexican military. They said, oh, no, you can't, Mr. Ambassador, because this is all, it's a sealed indictment. So for grand jury secrecy rules, which I'm familiar with from my days as a lawyer, you can't talk to anybody about this. So I'm like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, you're telling me that we're planning to arrest somebody and I can't even talk to anybody, not even my own military attaché? Like, what's the point of having a military attaché then? So what we wound up doing was kind of a half-assed solution where, I got the people from the U.S. Attorney's Office on the phone. They walked through the case with me, sent me some of the evidence, had to get me, signed into the grand jury secrecy stuff. It was all kind of crazy. And, ultimately, I kind of said, well, he's already indicted. I can't really undo that. So I just said, okay, I hope he never goes to the States. I mean, it was one of those, in retrospect, I wish I had fought this all the way to the Attorney General and to stop this, because as one might expect, I mean, the people who really made this decision to indict him were people only in the Department of Justice, right? But whether or not we indict the former head of the Mexican military has huge implications for our relations with Mexico across the board. But nobody else was brought into this discussion. I mean, I was just informed of the fact, but I wasn't asked for my views on whether or not it was a good thing. And it turned out my instinct was correct, that it was a terribly disastrous thing, that, the Mexican military basically, went to López Obrador and said, you better support us on this. This is really important to us. And he's actually using the military for a lot of his domestic projects. So it became really important to him. And so, he pushed through this bill to reduce contact with the DEA and our law enforcement agencies. So again, this is, I think, a classic example of where a failure of consultation on the side of the US government has put us in a much worse position overall. And, this guy was out of power. The allegations were that he worked with this cartel that was like two guys in Nayarit state who, not helpfully for our case, had actually been attacked by the prior Mexican government while he was in government and killed by the Mexican government. So they wiped out that cartel. And there was no evidence of any unjust enrichment. He wasn't living in a mansion. So, to me, one of my great takeaways, and I'd like to talk publicly about this, is that the executive branch needs to be better coordinated when it does this. I heard other horror stories that they indicted the brother of the president of Honduras and told the embassy in Tegucigalpa the night before it happened. Like, we cannot expect to have a coherent foreign policy with that kind of, Keystone Cops approach. And to his credit, the Attorney General reviewed the matter and sent the guy back and said, something, the overall interests of our law enforcement cooperation with Mexico are bigger than this one guy. But again, I think it is very problematic. I think at the end of the day, tempers will cool, and notwithstanding the law, we'll make it work, because I just think both countries don't really have any other solution. But it was a real, I think, unnecessary shot. We shot ourselves in the foot.
Chris, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you very much for that answer. And thank you for a bravura presentation to our members, our audience today. Thanks for making the time available, and welcome to membership in the Council of American Ambassadors.
I am honored to be part of this. I think there's so much that we can discuss. I mean, I wish that I had many more contacts, kind of horizontal contacts with other ambassadors out in the field, as opposed to just vertical contacts with Washington. I think there's a lot we can talk about to try to make American diplomacy more effective. So I welcome being part of this club and part of that conversation.
Well, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And we hope we'll be able, thanks to efforts like yours, to stimulate even more discussion on those topics among ourselves and with our colleagues in government. With that, I thank everyone for joining us today on this program, and Chris for his time, and bid you all farewell. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining, everyone.